Hey everyone, how's it going today? Can you guys hear me okay? Just type in the chat box if you guys can hear me just fine. Awesome, great. Looks like there are only about 7 people here right now, so I'm going to wait another minute. Is everyone adjusting to the time change? I actually woke up extra early this morning. So how was it this week with the lesson? I know it was a little challenging doing the scumbling. While we're waiting for a few people to kind of trace in. Do you guys have any questions I can address apart from your individual questions on your work? Oh, that's good. You got some sleep. I've actually had quite a rough week sleeping. I'm not sure why. Probably sensing the time change coming up. Hey everyone. So, okay, so any questions about the scumbling? I know a lot of people were saying they had issues with the paint, and I've tried to work through some of the problems that you guys were having with that. Sometimes, the brand of the pigment can make a big difference in, how the paint spreads out. I use one of 2 brands and types of paint. I use the Flemish White from Blue Ridge, and I just recently switched over to using Lead White number 2 from Natural Pigments or Rublev. Those are really, really good quality, highly pigmented paints. Kate, you're asking thumbs up or down on Michael Harding Titanium White 3 with dryers. I haven't used it, but I know Michael Harding's pigments are really, really good quality, so you should be fine with that. You might find that it's maybe a little more opaque, but again, the only reason I use lead whites instead of titanium is that titanium's more opaque. It also is a cooler white. It's a little bit more of a bluish white, whereas lead white tends to be more of a warm yellow white, which I find helps me with my skin tones, not only in the underpainting technique, but also with regards to when you're color mixing. A lot of people struggle with, your flesh tones ending up looking pasty. It doesn't mean you can't paint a portrait really, really well using titanium white. Plenty of artists do. It's just my preference for the texture and the paint handling is the lead white. And I know a lot of people don't like using lead white because of, exposure to lead, and that's perfectly fine as well. But just to kind of ease some of your worries, so long as you wear gloves, you don't eat while you're painting, you're careful about touching your eyes, if you have lead white on you, just be cautious about how you use your paint. Never sand it, so that you don't inhale it. And that's pretty much it. A lot of the old masters who got lead poisoning, it's because they had lead ground and they sanded their panels and, they didn't understand it, causing issues. So you can minimize your exposure to the lead through those precautions. And also, like when you wash your brushes, wear gloves, there's little things you can do. I know in some areas you can't access lead white because it's not allowed to be sold, which is where I recommend the zinc. However, zinc is really not that fun to work with. It depends on the brand, but it is way more transparent than the lead white. So some of you are having that kind of milky effect, and that's probably due to the zinc. It could also be due to thinning out your paint too much with medium. Really, when you're scumbling, you're trying to rely on you're thinning out the paint over the surface and kind of scrubbing it in, which is why a stiffer brush can be more useful. Let me catch up on some of the questions. So Susan, you asked, do you think a flake white replacement paint makes it hard to paint with? Seems to dry very quickly. Yeah, I know some of you guys had that issue, like it was flaking off or like crumbling as you were trying to spread it out. That seems to be, you know, from what I've had that issue before, but usually only when I was working on a really, really absorbent panel or surface where it seemed to like just suck the oil out of my paint as I was painting it. And usually, like if you're working on like a traditional gesso ground, it's almost chalky and it sucks out the oil as you're painting and it makes it hard to blend. In those cases, I just added a lot of oil to my paint before I started to apply it to kind of counterbalance that. But it can be frustrating. So it could be the panel that you're using, or it could be the paint. The lead white replacements or flake white replacements could be causing that as well. So what I would like to see you do is maybe test out a little titanium white if you have some and see if you're having the same issue. If you are, then it's the panel, and if you're not, then it's probably the pigment. And if you want your titanium to dry a little faster, just use a little quick dry medium like the Liquin, or you can mix it with your zinc white and see if that just improves the working quality of it. Jackie, you had a question about cleaning. Is it okay to clean in a sink? Yeah, it's okay to clean lead white in a sink. Of course, you always rinse out as much as you can into your turpentine jar or your Gamsol, and then just wear gloves when you're scrubbing your brushes clean, and don't do it in maybe a sink where you eat out of. I have a utility sink in my laundry room, or I'll use the bathroom sink, and you shouldn't have an issue. There's such a minor residue of the lead in there, it's not going to be a concern. Of course, when you're disposing of the kind of sediment in your canisters, in your paint canisters for brush cleaning, you want to be careful handling that because it's going to be a concentration of lead and other pigments. Just wear gloves and then take it down to one of those toxic waste disposal places. Let me catch up on some of the questions, and then we'll get started with the critiques. So should you use oil instead so it won't dry out as fast? That could be some of the issue, maybe, is if it already is kind of a pigment that's drying really quickly or it's absorbing into the surface, maybe you try using linseed oil instead of the Liquin, because Liquin does speed up the drying. And you also said you use Gamblin. Yeah, the best way, Susan, for you to test that, if it's the pigment or the panel, is, again, try using a little bit of titanium white or a different white if you have one, and just see if you have the same effect. Yeah, instead of the Liquin, use oil. If your surface is so absorbent and it's drying quickly on you and you don't have enough time to blend out, then instead of the Liquin, use a little bit of linseed oil. But that's only if you're having that issue with the paint kind of crumbling as you're trying to blend it out. All right, so let's go ahead and get started on some of the... Now, I know some of you had sent in questions too, so I'll kind of address your questions specifically with each critique. So, Kelly, did I see you in here? Susan, so you didn't do an isolation layer? It's not always necessary. I don't always do one, but if your panel was really kind of absorbent, do you know what brand panel you used or painting surface? Because an isolation layer can actually help if your painting is too absorbent, or if like the ground that you're using is really, really absorbent, then doing an isolation layer kind of helps with that. So, but in this next video, they were released yesterday, so some of you might have already seen some of them, but we're actually painting over these light masses with a more opaque layer and getting more specific with the form. So, and you know, mixing our value strings. So, you know, this underpainting portion that we did last week is really just kind of your guide. It's another step to developing the drawing before we get too involved in, you know, making more final adjustments. So, you know, it's okay if, you know, it looks a little chalky, or, you know, that's part of that's going to be just the effect of thinning out white over a darker ground. It's called the turbid effect, and it was used in Flemish and Dutch painting. A lot of times in those paintings, the blue grays that you see in the skin are actually white mixtures of skin tones scumbled very thinly over a darker ground, and it gives a bluish cast. So that is part of kind of the effect that this technique can create. And sometimes I'll leave my painting at this stage and then just jump into color. But since we're doing tonal, we're going to develop the portrait in the light mass more with mixed values, as you'll see in the new lessons this week. So it's okay if you feel like, I know some of you said, did I ruin my painting? Do I have to start all over? And I said, no, just keep going. We're going to get you on track in today's critiques. And you'll be able to make some of those adjustments in the second paint layer. Okay, yes, the live streams are saved. They are saved to, like, after an hour, about an hour after YouTube processes our live stream and it's ended. It takes about an hour for them to kind of encode it and post it to my account. So if you go over to, you can click my little portrait in the chat box. It might take you to my account page, and you can subscribe, and you'll get, you'll be able to find my account very easily that way. And it should be posted on there, and they'll be labeled, like this one, they'll be labeled Critique 2, Group A and B. Hi, Lori. Good to see you. Okay, so, oh, sorry, Kelly. So let's get started with the critiques. So we have a lot of people to get through. So, so let me just, first I'm going to bring up a couple of things, because in this stage, oftentimes if you've lost something in your translation, or when we transferred the drawing, sometimes we might have lost an area. I know some of you had transfer issues. I even lost the placement of the mouth when I'd transferred because I hadn't traced my drawing dark enough, and I was kind of, I'd kind of let it slip down a little bit. So I ended up adjusting it in this new week's videos. So you'll see kind of how to make drawing corrections in the new lesson this week. And so I'm going to give you guys some drawing suggestions for corrections in this layer. So that way when you work into your second layer more opaquely, it'll be easier for you to make some of those corrections. So let me just put this over here. So here are some of the suggestions I have. She has a little bit fuller hair up to the left here. And that's going to kind of give you that same angularity that we see here in the portrait. It's just going to give you a little bit more of a dynamic range. So you can start to just build out a few of the curls and break up some of this straight kind of rounded edge, and allow some of the curls to be a little more dynamic. But one thing I noticed in the portrait here is that the cheek felt a little bit slender, and I couldn't quite tell where the jawline was down in here. So my suggestion would be to bring the cheek out with just a little bit of your light scumble, or you could wait until you're doing the mixed value layer, but just take the right value and bring it over to about this point. And the ear, I don't think you need to bring the ear out too much wider. It'll stay about there. So I think that will make a big difference in getting the likeness to the subject. There were a few things with the nose, so let me take this away. So the nose just felt a little bit straight for the curvature here in the face that I see. So there's like this perspective here, and the nose felt a little bit centered to the left of that center line. So I think you need to push just a few lines over to the right. So one of the things that will help is to make your shadow shape here dip in just a little bit. You don't need to adjust the width of the nose too much. You might move your center line for the nostril over just a little bit and then bring out this nostril on wing on the right side a little bit wider. It's a very small amount, but it'll help the whole portrait feel a little more cohesive. I also noticed that your line here for the jawline felt a little bit narrow. See, it feels a little bit pushed up. So I would round that down just a little bit more. So bring that down, but leave the chin where it's placed. Let's see, there's a little more width to the iris here. So when I take out my lines, you can see that the left iris feels a little bit more squished horizontally than the right one. I think the right one's pretty good, but the left eye, yeah, I would make that a little bit wider to the right. And with this eye, I think I felt that the eye, the corner of the eye could just come down a little bit, not very much. Just pay attention to some of those angles there. When it comes to your values, remember to watch for, like when you're tiling in, remember to watch for some of the halftones, like here, this line that you have here in the like this section here. It's easy to make them too dark, but then it ages the person. So just if you look at her here, it's there in the inner corner towards the eye, but as it comes out on the cheek, that line starts to fade. And so I feel like you could lose some of that there. And then definitely pay attention to where it feels really intense and bright, because if you brightened up this area leading up the bridge of the nose, you'll notice that this section here might not need to be as dark because you're bringing more light in. So just think about your value controls and make sure you're not afraid to push your lightest light where it's appropriate. That was a little heavy-handed. So you can see also if we bring that cheek out, it's going to start to bring it a little bit more into the likeness of her portrait. So just pay attention to some of that. And I know the video lesson is very long this week. Take your time getting through each section. I'm going to kind of take a consensus maybe halfway through the week and see how everyone's feeling, because if everyone feels like they need more time to do this second tile layer where we mix the values, I might give everyone an extra couple of days or maybe an extra week. I don't want to push the class too long because I know we have Thanksgiving coming up and things get a little bit hectic, but I just want to make sure you guys don't feel like you're being rushed through this next layer. And there, like I said, there is a lot of video to watch. So, so more on that later. I'll kind of touch base with everyone and see how everyone's feeling. And then with the mouth, going back into the portrait, I think mostly what I'm seeing is that this lower left corner of the mouth, let me get back to my ink, this here, is a little bit high in your portrait. So I would drop that down about that much. Where you have the bottom lip placed, this line is good. The only other thing you need to do is bring that shadow over and give her a slightly fuller lip on the upper right side. And these are things that can be done. Again, in the video, I do show you guys how to make those drawing corrections. So if you want to sketch it in with a pencil first on top of your painting, you can absolutely do that. If you're kind of nervous about drawing it in and making the correction in paint, that is another option, is to lightly sketch it over this paint layer, and then when you go in to paint opaquely with your mixed values, you will know exactly where you're putting your new marks. Something to be just kind of careful about is adding light or white mixtures into the shadow, like here on the ear, because you notice it takes on kind of a grayish tone, and then the side plane of the cheek feels very warm. So to keep that kind of consistent throughout the painting, there's two things you can do. You can glaze over the ear with the transparent brown, okay, and that just means thin it out with a little medium and glaze over it. It should bring it back into some warmth. Or you can model some of the form in the shadow, you know, bring some of the reflected lights a little brighter using a little scumble of white like you did here, or a mixed gray, and then glaze it later so that it stays warm. I prefer to keep my shadows warm and the lights kind of more in the opaque cool range, because I just find it reads really nicely and it creates a kind of a nice vibrancy. And especially works because when you move, or if you choose to move into color on top of your tonal portrait, you have that nice warm undertone for the shadow mass, because typically shadows are warm and transparent in painting. Okay, so those were my suggestions. Everything else looked good, placement of the shoulders, and like I said, just pay attention to some of those halftones and be careful not to be too heavy-handed in areas like this here, or where you have the smile line. If you make them too hard or too dark compared to all of the light area around the portrait, or in that area of the portrait, it can feel too heavy, and it can also age the portrait a little bit. All right, so good job, and if you have questions or follow-up questions, just send me an email. All right, Kate, now I know you had quite a bit of trouble with the white as well, right? So you were kind of concerned about the zinc white being an issue, or is it the medium, too much medium, or is it the panel? So my feeling is that it's probably mostly the zinc white. Maybe you used a little too much medium with the zinc white, and because the zinc white is already very transparent. And the trick with doing the scumbles is that you basically, what you're trying to do is, you're not treating it so much like a glaze where you're thinning out with a medium, but you're kind of spreading the paint out thinly with a stiffer brush. Sometimes I will use medium, but it can get kind of streaky on you if you use too much medium, especially if you pick up more paint with medium, and then the mediums usually have a little bit like of a solvent in it, so it'll dissolve what paint you've already laid down, and kind of create more streaks, and then it's a little frustrating cycle. So so you're going to try the titanium zinc white. Yeah, I would try that. Williamsburg is a good brand, so you shouldn't have as much trouble with that, especially in the second layer. If you want to continue with the scumble while you make some of the adjustments, what I would suggest is first getting the placement of the nose and the ear, because the ear felt a little bit small. And also the mouth felt like it was dropped a little bit low and a little bit far to the right. So by moving the nose over, because what I was sensing was that there's just a little too much space in here between where you had your nose here. But also what that did as a result was had you push the mouth over to the right. So to get a little bit better foreshortening on the portrait here, move the nose over. You'll notice that, let's bring this up. You'll notice that the corner of her inner eye comes very close to the bridge of the nose. And maybe it's a little hard for you to see, so you can always lighten the photo to help you see that. But I think that will help you get a little bit more of a likeness. The eyes were in a good position. So once you move the nose, then you can use that to help you position the corners of the mouth, because the tip of the nose and the mouth kind of relate vertically. And then also you can use the nose and the eyebrows to position the height of the ear. So your ear is kind of down here, and I think it just needed to shift up, because that's going to affect the way we feel about the features here, the position of the ear. Even though the ear is not a really, really important part of the portrait, it does affect the age, because children's ears in ears in the elderly are usually positioned, they feel a little bit different. So it can be pretty important in terms of aging your subject. So your question is corrections made with glazing. What I would probably do is maybe if you look at the reference here, let me zoom out. You can see that she has a shadow on the left side of her nose. So I would start by glazing, with your dark shadow, just umber straight with a little bit of medium. And I would just glaze where the new shadow shape is, and that'll include where the edge of the nose is. And then you can scumble a little bit of white over this line for your old line, and that will help you start to see that a little better. And it doesn't have to be perfectly covered, just kind of work it towards that. Let that scumble dry, so maybe do that one day, and then go in with your opaque mixtures on top. And then you won't be struggling with the colors mixing together and getting muddy. And then with the mouth, because you're moving it up, I would do the same thing, maybe draw in, and you could even draw this part with a pencil first if you're just worried about getting it in the right place, and then go back in with paint. And I would scumble white over these areas, and then, so let me show you actually. I can just do a little demo. Okay, so if we were to kind of lightly scumble over this, okay, and then take a little bit of your brown and draw in where that new shadow shape is. And then same thing in here. Kind of drawing where the crease of the mouth is first. Get that dark shape, because that's how we read things really easily, is through the dark shapes, and I always find that's a little easier than dealing with the white. But it'll require a little bit of both. So just getting the new little shadow marks, and then taking your white and just doing a very light scumble over your old lines, just to kind of conceal them so they don't pop through, the new layer. So, and then of course your ear would be up there. So if you kind of look at the difference that's going to make, I know the nose is really, really bright now, but you can kind of see that it's going to help kind of lock in that portrait. Also, just make sure you don't make the nose too wide. But is that helpful to see? I can send you both the outline marks without this, and I can also send you a little bit of a paint over so you can kind of see where things should line up a little bit. And don't worry again about the milky kind of look here. What I would just recommend is If you want to do a second scumble, you said you're switching to a different color, so you could try doing a second layer scumble and just only hit the areas that you feel need it. So for example, like in the cheekbone, in this side plane here, a little bit in the forehead. I'm just going to do it very loosely. Just mostly pretty much on the right side of the face. Then this kind of milky halftone that you have here is going to kind of read as a darker halftone instead of being the lightest, and it'll give a little more development to the form before you go into the mixed values. But it's just optional. Just make sure you're pretty comfortable with where things are placed. That's more important for when you go into the tiling stage. Okay, any last questions? And when you try the new titanium, use like a stiffer brush. I like those synthetic, and then also try not to use much medium and just try scrubbing it into the surface and thinning it out. And you won't need very much titanium white because it tends to spread out pretty far. So just lightly load the brush and start with that and see how that feels. Okay? And then if you want to follow up with me by email, then like if after you make some of the corrections, or if you're having other troubles with the new white, just send me an email or message me on Facebook or something, and I'll try and help you troubleshoot and see what's going on. All right, perfect. By the way, is anyone going to the figurative art conference in Miami next week? Just curious if anyone's going, because I'm going to go. I just found out this morning that I'll be there. So I'll be doing our live stream next week from the hotel. Hopefully the Wi-Fi is good enough to make our stream, kind of smooth. But yeah, it's very expensive. I wasn't going to go, but I had an opportunity to jump in. A friend of mine can't attend, and it's too late for her to get a refund. So I'm very blessed in that way because I've been wanting to go to this. I used to go to the track conferences in Los Angeles, the Representational Art Conference. That one's also really good. Well, it depends, Susan. I've never been to this particular conference, so we'll see how it is. But I know there's a lot of demonstrations, and there's like a lot of live painting. I haven't been to this one in particular, so the perks. Well, there's opportunities to meet a lot of artists and kind of socialize. Of course, that's kind of part of the business side of things, but also demonstrations and I'm not 100% sure on this one what everything is, but I don't know if it's too late to enroll, but you can look it up. It's called Figurative Art Convention and Expo. I think it's hosted by, what is it? Is it Fine Art Connoisseur magazine, or it's one of those? It's kind of associated with them. But if you go to their website, you'll be able to find out a little bit more about it. Okay, so Jackie, let's get into your portrait. Yeah, so you were saying you had a little bit, let me see what your questions were. You were also using the zinc white, correct? And you were having issues. It was getting sticky too fast, so you were wondering if it was medium, or was it having to do with brushes? So you had a question about the brushes. So what I'm thinking is it seems like the zinc white is going down a little uneven. Yeah, it could have been too much medium. I try to be very conservative with how much medium I mix in. Of course, it depends. Like when I'm glazing something and I want it to be really delicate, like let's say within the shadow, you don't tend to have that streaking issue as much. But with the white, it will kind of want to lift sometimes, and it's hard to get real smooth. So maybe try starting it without the medium, and then if your paint is feeling too sticky, then adding a little bit of medium can help. So your brushes were long, so it was hard to scumble. Okay, so you got the long filberts? Yeah, my autocorrect always puts stumble instead of scumble. I always have to adjust that. Yeah, so it could be that those brushes were hard. Those long filberts, though, are going to be really, really nice for doing the next stage, which is the tiling, and that because they have a softer spring, they're not as firm. They're going to be really nice for laying down the paint and blending out some of the edges. You can use a different brush for the blending, but you can, like I think I use one of my Mongoose brushes just for blending some of the areas, but you can use any softer synthetic, or you can use those ivories, like a clean dry one, and you should be able to blend out your edges no problem. So for scumbling, I use the ivory filberts for it, but you could always try getting or using like a hog bristle or another firm brush. I keep a lot of my really old brushes that have kind of frayed out and kind of messed up because I use those for scumbling. I often find that they're kind of stiff from using them for years, and they work well for kind of scrubbing the surface. So you bought some titanium zinc white. You also bought lead. Which brand of lead white did you buy? Flemish. Okay, was it the Blue Ridge, the one I recommended? Or was it like Rublev or Natural Pigments? Blue Ridge, okay. Yeah, I think you'll really like that one. That one has a little bit of titanium in it. The Flemish white from Natural Pigments does not have any titanium white in it, but the one from Blue Ridge does, so it's a little bit more opaque, but it has that really nice ropey consistency that it makes blending out your edges and stuff really nice, and that's how I get a lot of texture in my work, because titanium white is soft and not nearly as tacky. There's just a kind of a tactile quality about the Flemish white and lead whites that I like, and it makes kind of blending out your edges and building paint texture really, really nice. Yeah, just, again, wear gloves, wear some nitrile gloves while you work, especially while you're mixing your colors. You'll be safe so long as you don't touch your face or get any paint on, in your eyes. Just being around lead paint, it's not going to do anything. If you have pets or kids around, just make sure you throw away your rags or put them out of an area where they can access them, your paint rags. And just never sand your lead with a sandpaper once it's dry. If you need to scrape off texture, use a palette knife. But those are the main issues. They say not to smoke cigarettes too while you're painting, but because if it's on your hands and then you're holding your cigarette, you can inhale it. That's not a problem for me because I don't smoke. So just be aware of that. And if you wear your gloves, especially when you're washing your brushes, you should be just fine. If you're still hesitant to use it, then you can try the titanium zinc white mixture, but you probably will feel a difference between those. And I was scared to use lead white for a long time too, but yeah, I as soon as I used it, it was like I found exactly what I was wanting out of my paint. There was a certain textural quality and kind of handling that I was kind of wanting, and I knew I could sense it in some of the old masterworks, and I couldn't figure out why their work felt a certain way, and how they got some of their brush marks. Because I'd tried all the mediums out there, impasto mediums and all that, and really it's come down to the lead white that they used. So ever since I switched, it's just kind of works with me and what I'm wanting out of, you know, my style. Let's just call it that. So yeah, play with it. If it's not for you, don't worry about it. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what we can do. So with your portrait, I don't think it's necessary to do another scumble, but if you wanted to, you could build up some of the lights in the face, especially like here in the cheek where it's really bright. Let me switch to ink. Okay, so the main thing I noticed, you said you felt like the eye got a little off in the transfer, and I think your placement for the eye is actually spot on. So it's just more the shape. So I feel like it's more that this needs to, let me open up my layer. This needs to open up a little bit more right here, and then close a little bit here to make sure you're getting that kind of diamond shape that she has in her eye. The only other minor thing was her eyebrow kind of comes more at an angle there, but that's really, really minor, so you don't really need to worry about it too much. And then with the nose, it was slightly wider here, and then this dot, this little dark spot you have here is just a little bit more to the left, but these are really minor. I would say the most important thing is getting the shape of that eye. The left eye felt just fine, and when you get more into the opaque layers, you'll probably find it easier to render out some of the more nuanced values in her eye. And then the only other thing I noticed was just her face felt a little wide from here to here, and maybe your scumble just got spread out a little bit, but you don't have to bring it in this much. That's just where the overlay was, but if you take in some of your brown, let me do a quick paint over. So if you just take your brown and bring it in kind of as a glaze, you might have to apply it a little heavier because her hair is quite dark back there, but just push it in a small amount. It'll start to feel more like her, because you can see with the corner of the mouth and the tip of the nose how close in proximity it is to that left side of the face. And that's a pretty easy fix. If you want to sketch where it is first with like a pencil and then, or charcoal, and then paint your brown over to that edge, that can work as well. And you'll also, as a result, want to bring the neck in just a little bit. Okay. Let me see if there were any others. Yeah, the hairline here on the right side, it's just a little simple. I know she has that straight line and then there's the little wisp. So just, not that you have to paint it in right now, just pay attention to that when you're working in the more opaque layer, the second coat. Oh yeah, it could have shifted, because I don't remember that being the case with your line drawing last week. So it probably is just that the paper maybe moved a little bit. That's the downside to doing the technique for transferring. You can lose some information in the translation, but the perk is that you always have your drawing so you can retransfer it over. And then just reassess this shadow shape here. You can see here it kind of dances in and out a little bit more, kind of like that. So just maybe yours has got a little bit straight through here. The only area I would say you could actually leave the jawline where it is, but maybe push a little bit of brown over here. And you can just do that when you're tiling with the opaque layers. That's really, really minor. And that could have happened, like you said, during like shifting as well. with the lip, I think it was just, it's not positioned, but it was more where that darker center line is. She has kind of a more square bottom lip, as you can kind of see here. So another thing with the bottom lip is just using more light on it. So what I'd recommend is going in, oops, let me open up that, and just doing a little more of a scumble over that top, or I mean, sorry, over that bottom lip. Because if you kind of squint at the photo reference, she has that little dark mass here on the right, this little, oops, this little diamond shape here. If I can get my pencil to work. So yeah, you can see that there, but that's pretty minor. I think overall what's more important is how, you know, full and kind of square and also light. The light on this lip here is in a whole different value range. If you kind of isolated those areas, if you looked at like this section, kind of squint your eyes, and then you looked at the light section here, you can squint and you'll see that they're two whole different values. And so I would, yeah, just push your bottom lip a little more into the light, and that should do it. I would definitely try switching from the zinc and try either the lead white. You'll probably feel a difference with that lead white if you did like a little scumble just to brighten up a few areas. It also is warmer than the zinc or titanium white, so this bluing effect that you see here won't come through as strong. It still will, because that's just the nature of this technique, but it will feel a little bit more warm like you saw in mine. In the end though, this underneath scumble is going to get covered up, so I don't know if you've watched the new videos yet, but you don't need to worry about the temperature because it's going to change as soon as we do our mixed values. Okay, so do you have any questions? Yeah, it's really, it's like you make a small change here and a small change there, and then it adds up. Sometimes it's just a little tweak, and a lot of times that's the hardest part to see because you've been staring at the work, and work always looks different in person because of its size. And I often sometimes will take a photograph of my drawing and I'll look at it smaller, because by seeing it as a thumbnail, I can see those big picture issues a little bit easier. That's kind of a tool I'll use. Also, that's why I talk about stepping back from your drawing. And in the new videos, I correct the placement of the mouth and the lower jawline because it was bothering me. So, but it didn't pop out to me until later. So sometimes that happens, and you can kind of see that and make small changes, but then it adds up and makes a big impact on the overall feel. Now, you were saying you had an issue with the straps on on her shirt, and you weren't going to paint those in. That's no problem. You don't need to worry about that. This is primarily focused on the portrait, and I talk a little bit about that in this next series of videos as well. I painting in her shoulders, I just very loosely block them in because I'm trying to focus more on the portrait. So yeah, good job, and just if you have any issues with the new paint, reach out to me. All right, Susan. Are you in here, Susan? I know because we changed the day, some of you guys weren't able to attend live, and that's okay. Thank you for being flexible. I was teaching a workshop yesterday. So, okay. My main suggestion, there were really minor ones, but I feel like the left side of her head, just to kind of influence the tilt, a little bit more squared off through this area here. And so I would just push her hair out a little bit, look for that nice acute kind of angle. And then with the right eye, I did feel see, that her eye was a little bit more open. It's pretty minor, but I think if you just push this dark shape for her, for the lash line and also her eyeliner, and also open up the iris a little bit more, it'll feel a little more cohesive with her portrait. But otherwise, you have a really great likeness, and you can move into the next stage. Another thing I noticed just slightly different was her jawline. It got a little rounded out, and you can see she kind of has this squareness on the right side of her jaw in here. And there are, so I'll draw that in, so you can kind of see there's this angle, and then this rounds it out, this shadow shape. So I would just make sure that you can push that down a little bit. And you'll usually notice that this angle change in the jaw can correlate with the mouth. It depends on the tilt of the head and the person, but just look for that little relationship and you should have it pretty good. I know it's kind of a nuanced area, so you can make that change pretty easily in the opaque layer. So you're thinking her face feels too wide. You know, I think some of that is, I don't feel that on the left side as much as maybe like through here. But when I checked it, it seemed pretty accurate. So my feeling is that the light tone that you have right in here got pushed to the right, so it's making her face feel more rounded and full. Almost like you just added a little more weight onto her. So let me quickly look between the two. Yeah, I think it's really, really close. If you wanted to, let me see. Let me put a couple of dots for these key points. Yeah, see, your placement is really close. Maybe a smidgen to, and I think that's why I didn't note it here. A little bit too wide right here, but it's almost like the width of a brush. I mean, it's really, really narrow difference. I think part of it is that softness of that form there, because if you look in her cheekbone, she has this very sculpted kind of mid-tone here, and her brightest highlight is closer to the eye, and you have your highlight kind of more next to the curl, and we're kind of missing that sculpted shape for the cheekbone. So when you're tiling in for, and also you rounded this out, so it's making it feel shorter. So if you drop that corner of the jawline down just a little bit and gave it a little more of a squareness right through here, that should give her that more slender feeling to the face. Because everything else seemed really, really, really close. So I can even do a little paint over as well. So if we moved the emphasis, trying to get both the reference and your painting in frame. So if we brought more of the emphasis of the highlight here, and brought maybe that mid-tone down, and then maybe brought a little bit, she almost has a little bit of light that comes in under her cheekbone too, and it kind of gives her that more sculpted feeling to the cheekbone through here. Oops, that was a little heavy. It'll give her a little bit less of that kind of wide face. You can also, maybe part of it is where you have, what I'm feeling is that maybe where you have that line edge placed, she has more width. Let me get a narrower brush. She has a little more width from here to here. And yours comes pretty close. So maybe moving that dark edge to the left. It's not real dark, but it's a darker mid-tone. So maybe giving a little more space where that cheekbone kind of comes in will help as well. Obviously you don't want to make it that dark, but I'm just kind of emphasizing where I see it. And that should be kind of a slow roll of form coming up. Might even be just a little bit higher than where I just drew it. Something like that. And when we really round out forms, it can cause that kind of feeling, because what we're not getting is that feeling of the bone coming to the surface. Usually you'll have a sharper light where those bones come to the surface, where the skull surfaces on the face, and you'll have softer kind of turning forms where you have more tissue. So her face being so rounded out and smooth in a way is making her seem a little heavier and wider. So yeah, maybe try bringing oops. All right, so yeah, bringing that over a little bit will help narrow the feeling of the face as well. Do you have any other questions? Yeah, because my first instinct also was that the left side was too wide, but when I had compared it, it was really close. It could also be too that you have this smile line here that's really kind of heavy, and it's kind of feeling like it's pulling that down. I would maybe readdress just the way the curl of the corner of the right side of the mouth here ends, and see if that you really do have that line connecting. It's more, she has more of a break in this section in the tone. The smile line is more like right there, and then she has a second one here, and there's a little more light that passes over here to here. So try looking at that too, because that can affect the way we read some of the forms. So yeah, how you can fix the left side by painting when you go in with the mixed value. Remember, we added a little bit of white to this value. If you go pretty close to that, you could go in and push in some of those areas. You can also paint a slightly lighter value, like you see here in the background. Just mix your umber with the white, and then you should be able to adjust some of those contours. I did that in some of mine, especially for blending some of these edges and hiding the lines from the transfer. So you'll see that, how I kind of handle that in the new videos. All right, so good job. You really do have a likeness, so these little tweaks is just going to make it feel all that much more like her. All right, so Angela. Are you in here, Angela? All right, well, so there were a few things that I felt needed adjusting to get her likeness a little bit more. Part of it was the position of the mouth. It's not that the eyes aren't in a relatively close position, but more where the position of the mouth is in relationship to the eyes, as you can see kind of when I flash between the two. So what I would suggest is making some adjustments to the position of the mouth, but also look at where you have the irises of the eyes. When I looked, you have the position of the inner corner of the eye and the outer corner of the eye just fine. But where you have the placement of the iris is a little bit too far to the right. So it's making her eyes look like they're going in two different directions, just a little bit. So if you move the right iris here, here's where you have yours positioned. So move it over to the left and just open up this shape here, kind of pushing it up that way. You should lock in a little bit more likeness in her eyes. I felt like the left eye was really, really close. It's just felt like it got a little too open on the bottom part. But where you have the lid here and the upper eyelash line seems pretty close. Even the iris seems really close. It's just you have your bottom lid down here and it needs to be a little bit more closed. Does that make sense? And just check the width of the cheekbone. She doesn't have as prominent of a shape here. It's really minor, but that's going to help. Kind of look at the position between these points. Your jawline was spot on. So if you bring that cheekbone in and actually this was in the right place too, just look at that subtle relationship between those points. The only other thing that threw me off was the neck. Where you have the chin is also good. Just bring that neck in and raise this shoulder up, because that's going to help the neck feel a little more centered and positioned correctly with the face. And then when you look at some of the shadow shapes in this eye socket here, notice how the shadow shape has kind of like this pattern. So I think you might have opened this up a little bit too wide, but mostly it's that this shadow shape that you have is a little more complex than it needs to be, and this shape here got too wide over to the right. So what I would do is this is where the shadow shape should be. You just got to fill in that little light spot right here with dark, and then fill in this little light spot with dark, and you'll have the correct shadow shape. I would be careful about making lines like this a little dark too, because if you make them, again, too dark or too heavy, it can age the model quite a bit. And then when it comes down to, same thing, down into the sternum and the clavicles, these are very subtle halftones. So if you were to isolate the value of this, I know they look really dark compared to the brightest lights next to them, but if you compared that value to the face, it's about the same value as that section on the cheek or that section on the forehead. So just make sure you're not going too dark in those areas. Does that make sense, Angela? So with regards to the positioning of the lips, I did a little paint over. All I did was kind of cut out the lips shape that you have and move it over to the left a little bit. And so that's with the paint over, and you can see it starts to feel a little bit more like her. Okay, and that's where you have them positioned. The sternum should be considered part of the light mask, so it'll be white. It'll be a mixture, I mean, because it does have halftones. So in the new layer, when we're mixing your value scale, just make sure you're keeping that section in considered the light mask. So anything that's shadow mask is something this dark. Okay, so this is a shadow mask, this is a shadow mask, all of this, including her hair. This is a shadow mass. So if you compare the shadow here to that value there, that should tell you whether or not it's a shadow, which means umber, or if it's a light mass, which means a white mixture. Does that make sense? So yeah, my suggestion would be just make sure you move the position of the mouth. Your shape was pretty close for the kind of feeling and characteristic of her lips. Just make sure you push it over to the left a little bit more. So I'll show you again where yours are, and that's where they should be. So this should be kind of the center of the lips. The height was really close. I think it's mostly that they need to go over to the left. A little bit up higher too on the top lip, but it was mostly the position left to right. All right, so yeah, good job. And a lot of these corrections will be easier to make in the second layer with the mixed values, but if you feel more comfortable sketching in where the lip is positioned here with a pencil before you go into paint, you can do that on top of your paint and it'll get covered up. Okay? Any last questions? Oh, well, you had asked here how to get the scumble smooth. What white paint were you using? Were you using zinc white or lead white? So the trick to getting a scumble really smooth is to use small amounts of paint. I know some of you had asked also, do you let your brown dry? So you were using Gamblin Flake White replacement. Was it kind of crumbling on you or drying up on you as you were trying to spread it out? They felt pretty similar. So you could use either one. To get it smooth, think of it like you're shading with a pencil. Okay, you're spreading it out very thin over the surface. So start with a small amount of white and then slowly build it up. If you add too much medium, it might get a little streaky, so I tend to use just straight paint. If I feel like it's too thick or drying out, like some of the other students have had an issue with that, then you might use a little oil to help the paint flow. But if you add too much oil, again, it's just getting familiar with your materials, then it can get kind of streaky and hard to control. But it's kind of like applying like a white pencil to paper. It's not as easy as doing that, but it's very similar in terms of concept. So one thing you guys might consider practicing, yeah, and usually I do multiple layers of white, yes. But you'll see in the next videos that they were put up yesterday, but that we go more in with an opaque layer. So this was just kind of think of it like a value roadmap for the upper layers, and it's also so that you can see how the drawing's coming together, because as you guys can see after the transfer, some of us are still making some drawing corrections. So it's like an in-between step before we move into more of a direct painting approach. All right, Beth, are you with us, Beth, today? I think I had... Did you send me anything, Beth? I'm not sure I have anything in here. Hold on, let me make sure I didn't miss something. Yeah, I didn't get anything from you, Beth. I'm just making sure. Hold on, guys. I'm just checking my email to make sure I didn't miss anything. Okay, I haven't received anything, so we're just going to move on. But Beth, if you're watching this, you and I can do a little makeup critique if you missed something, or maybe I didn't get your email. So just check in with me a little bit later, and we'll go over your painting. Susan, so you and Angela have the same paint that you're using. It could be that paint. I haven't used that. Usually Gamblin's a pretty decent brand. I use their paint for other ones, but Flake White Replacement, it varies a lot brand to brand. Some will have actual lead in it, some won't. Some will be like zinc, for example, and a mixture of zinc and titanium. It kind of depends on the brand. You can see what pigments are in your paint. If you look on the back, it'll tell you the pigment code. It's like usually like PR and then a number. And if you look those up, you can see exactly what pigments are in your paint. And it could be that that particular mixture is not the best. Yeah, usually they won't have lead replacement, but if you get something like Winsor Newton Crimnance White, that's actually a lead-based paint. I stopped using Crimnance though because I had similar issues. It was also very, very thin, and it doesn't have as much of a covering power as the the lead whites that I recommended on the list. So maybe you guys should try. You can switch to a titanium white for this next layer if you want. If it gives you better luck, it's not, like I said, as big of a deal. The reasons for me using a lead white are pretty nuanced, and there are benefits to it. It's quicker drying than titanium, and it's more transparent, which really plays more of a role when you're mixing color. So it doesn't tend to wash out your colors so easily. Yes, Flemish white has lead in it, Susan. Typically, I mean, it's usually a lead white, and it depends on the company. Some companies put a little titanium with the lead white and for Flemish, and others don't. But the two companies I recommended are probably the best for getting a good Flemish white. I don't know if Michael Harding makes one or if Williamsburg makes one, but it's worth a look. I do know like RGH oil paints, I believe they have a flake white or a lead white as well. So you can always look into them. Just make sure you're not buying a lead white pigment. If it says lead white pigment, you're buying powdered pigment, and you don't want to be around that stuff. Make sure you're buying lead white oil paint. It sounds very similar, but just make sure you're buying the paint, not the pigment. I know some people who mill their own lead, and that's just too intense for me. I try to minimize my exposure to it because I plan to use it the rest of my life. Hopefully, the companies I use keep making it. Okay. So I'm just making sure we're on order. So Kim, you are up. Are you with us here today, Kim? I think I saw you in here. All right, so what I'm seeing here, there weren't too many changes as far as drawing goes. A little bit in the right side of the mouth. It's really minor, but it feels like it got a little bit too high. You can see in this section right here, right in here. If you kind of look at that when I go between the two. But everything else seems like it's right in place. The nose looks good. Another thing I would look for is here in this left eye. This one looks like it's kind of looking out, oops, like a little more straight, and this one's looking more up. And all that has to do with is this curvature. So I would maybe open up the top here and leave the bottom where it is, and that will get the eyes to kind of look up. You want these little semicircle shapes to be pretty similar to get the eyes looking in the same direction. And with regards to the mouth, I mean, these are really minor, so I think we'll just kind of look at placement of the lips. It's just a little bit lower. I ended up entirely moving the mouth in my painting, so if you want, and it's pretty easy to do in the second layer, so if you want to do that, it still looks like her, so I don't think it's that big of a deal. It still feels pretty good. If you want to leave the position of the lip, what I would do is just shorten it a little bit so you get more foreshortening going across this way, and you don't have to drop it down so drastically. So I'll let you decide what you want to do with that. It still looks correct in the portrait overall, but I would maybe just shorten it a little bit, and let me look real quick. And then where you have this angle change here, maybe bring it down, or maybe change where that little angle change sits, and I would move it over to the left a little bit. Does that make sense? It's really, really minor, but I think it's mostly about getting the foreshortening across the mouth a little more accurate. But you did really great with the scumble. It looks really nice. What paint did you use? Did you use a lead white or a titanium? Anyhow, titanium. Oh, okay, titanium and flake white. What brand was it? I'm just wondering because it seems like you had a pretty smooth application, and it didn't. Did it give you any trouble? Was it? I mean, I know it's probably challenging because it's oil paint, but it didn't like crumble on you or anything like that? Some people were having it like. Yeah, I'm not sure why there's a bit of a delay. I'll look into the settings, but it could just be between the chat and then me waiting to see your response. Winsor Newton. Okay, so you did 2 layers and drawing between them. That's pretty good. All right, well, I think your drawing looks great. So other than the mouth and that eye, I think you can move into the second stage. If the white wasn't giving you any trouble, then I would just continue using it for the mixed value layer. Did you have any particular questions? Yeah, when I do the scumbling, sometimes it requires 2 layers, but because I switched to a very highly pigmented lead white, I actually can kind of build it up in the first layer, which is what I did with our session, but it still felt a little dark, I would say, to me. And I would probably have continued building it up. But you can see in the new videos that I actually bring my painting up even brighter. It's just the scumble layers kind of to help us get started in that direction. No, I don't think you use too much white. You just want to be selective about where you place those brightest highlights. If it spreads out, you know, pure white almost over all the form and you lose some of these nuanced halftones, it's more with the second layer that you're kind of worried about that than this layer. But you do have a nice fall off of light across the form. You didn't get real bright, you know, next to the shadow. So I think, you know, this is a great start for moving into the next stage of the painting. Yeah, if you add, I think I had explained that earlier. I don't know if you were logged in earlier, but if you added any white in here, or if you go in to brighten, let's say you went too dark for your reflected light. I'm not saying you did, but let's just say you accidentally went too dark. You can go into the next layer slightly more opaque with a slightly lighter value, but it is going to have kind of a gray feeling like what we get here. And to counterbalance that, what you can do is at the very end, after lightening it up, you could actually glaze over this with a transparent umber, and it'll take on some of that reddish appearance again. So I'll show how to do that a little bit later. Yeah, and I would just thin out the glaze so that it's more, not so much darkening it, but it's just adding that slightly warmer tint. And you can do multiple glazes. It you know, build each one's kind of slower. But yeah, really nice job. I look forward to seeing your painting next time after the next layer. Okay, so let's see. Catherine. Are you with us, Catherine? I know you said you had a heck of a time with the white and you were having some issues as well. Kind of losing your drawing, and you were afraid you weren't going to be able to get it back on track. So I'm going to just show you first a couple of my suggestions. There were only a few areas, actually, you'd be surprised, that will help kind of bring the portrait back to, you know, where you had it in the drawing. Okay, part of it is, I think, in the shadow side, we lost a sense of where the side of the face was, and it's looking a little bit straight. So what you can do is, since your paint layer is dry, you could go in and sketch with a pencil on top to reestablish some of the drawing. You could also take your transferred drawing, the one that you used to transfer onto the painting, and then you can take another sheet of tracing paper, or you could even take a clear sheet of, what's it called? It's almost like that clear plastic sheeting. I'm forgetting the name of it right now. You can like draw a marker on it and that sort of thing. Anyhow, you can take any kind of transparent kind of paper and put it over your old drawing that's on the paper, and kind of trace the drawing that you had, and then lay it over your painting and see where things are off. That's one of the ways that can kind of help you get the drawing back. But I'll also, of course, be sending you some of this. So what I'm noticing is just that you need to work on getting the placement of the side of the jaw. Oh, acetate. Thank you, Jackie. Yeah, it was like, I know it's like an A word, but I couldn't remember what it was. Thank you. Oh, yeah, 3 people said acetate. Sorry, I wasn't looking at our chat box. Yeah, so you can use acetate, and that can help you, even if you just placed kind of points from your transfer drawing. Just give yourself a couple of points to make sure you can line up. Of course, use the eyes. I would always use the eyes as kind of the anchor in your drawing, so make sure you're lined up with the eyes, and then everything else should kind of fall into place. So my feeling is, overall, the mouth on the right side is placed correctly. You just need to redefine where it is on the left side, so right in here. And I colored this in just a little bit lighter because we needed to open up this shadow shape a little bit. But you can see when I kind of bounce back and forth, it's really about defining that left side and being a little more clear about where, you know, the features are placed. But overall position and height and placement right to left, there wasn't anything major. So it shouldn't be as difficult as it seems to get those areas locked in. Okay, so if I did the acetate, it would look kind of like what you see here, these dots here, just for placement, and then I would lay it over the painting and see where I need to make some of those adjustments, draw that in with pencil, and then go into the paint layer. Yeah. What paint are you using, Kathy? Were you using like a lead white or titanium? Because if your paint is really pasty and thick, sometimes the Crimnance white is like that. Oh, Winsor Newton flake white. Okay. Yeah, it could be that you added too much medium and it kind of got mushy and spread out. I would definitely make sure you let this layer dry before you go in and do this next stage. And before you go in with mixed values, I would just use scumbles to make some of the drawing corrections. So maybe glazing with some umber to make the left side of the face darker than the ground in the background. Leave the background where it is and then just darken this shadow shape. And then push over your light mass. Even if it looks kind of flat like this, that's okay. We'll get a little bit more form going in the second layer. So don't worry about that too much. Do you have any questions? That is one of the benefits. This is a great example of when something happens in the painting and you have a drawing that you can still refer back to. You know, you're drawing from the transfer, so there is kind of a benefit to that as well, because sometimes these things happen. I was telling another student that I had a couple of drawings I did for transfers, and I'd transferred everything, but I decided, this was a couple months ago, I decided to take a shortcut, and instead of doing an oil transfer like I taught here, I used a transfer paper because it was just easier and less messy. But I regretted it because it set me back about 2 weeks of work. So I transferred all the drawings and I was painting. I was already doing the underpaintings like this. And then I realized that the paint was scraping off where my lines were transferred. And it was scraping back to the white of my ground. And it's because the transfer paper I had bought, I didn't realize, had wax in it. And so my paint was not sticking to my panel. I can't sell that because it's going to flake off, right? So I had to sand my entire panel all the way down to the ground again. And I had already thrown out all my drawings for some reason. I don't usually do that. So it set me back about 2 weeks of work. So that's why I stick to the oil transfer and also keep your drawings, because you don't want to end up having to start all over again. And another thing, I know some of you were having trouble with the transfer, and one of the another method for doing a transfer is to use an oil pastel to trace the lines on the back of the paper instead of coating the whole back. And then when you transfer, it transfers in oil pastel, and then that will just kind of dissolve into your paint layers. That's perfectly okay as well. But I didn't want anyone having trouble getting some of the oil pastels, because you have to use a really good quality one for that. I like the Sennelier burnt umber, and sometimes it tends to transfer a little lighter than the method we use. So, but that's something you can try and experiment with. So you had a question about the nose because you can't see it, the left side that's in shadow. Yeah, lighten the photocopy. Can you see it here in the screen a little better? You might lighten the photo enough to where you can see where this edge is here in the nose. And it could be, if you're working from a print, prints always come out a little darker than looking at a screen of the photo. So you might lighten it and then try reprinting just so you can see what you're looking at. Even if it's not what you use for painting, the tones from, just lightening it so that you can get the drawing and placement can be really helpful. Yeah, lightening it, like for example in this inner corner eye here area, you can see there's, it's a little difficult to see, and if I had printed this out, it would probably get, all of this would get kind of lost into one shape. But I can see it here on the screen just fine. But I think I lightened this example a little bit. It's not so much about detail, but it's more about getting correct placement for those features. The details will kind of be added in to the paint layers as each thing progresses. So focus on getting placement first. All right, and if you have questions as you're if you draw in everything and you want me to take another look at it before you start painting, just send me a picture and I'll let you know if it seems good to move forward. Because I know you felt like you lost a lot of this in here, so. Alrighty, so I'm going to go ahead and move on, but if you have any follow-up questions, just let me know. Oops. Okay. Lori, are you with us right now? We're running a little bit behind schedule. So I just wanted to see, Janine, I hope you don't mind, but Lori has somewhere to be very soon, so I might cover hers first and then jump back over to you. The time zone difference for her is very... Okay, so Janine, are you in here? I thought I saw you in here earlier. Okay, perfect. Yeah, thank you, because I know Lori has somewhere to be very soon, and you're all the way in Australia, right? Big time zone difference. Okay. I appreciate you getting up so early in the morning to attend our live sessions. Okay, so I know you had a couple of questions, and you sent me a close-up to show me some of the issues you were having with the white. So some of your questions, let me just address those first. So you were asking about the medium kind of being runny, and your paint, you were using Winsor Newton mixing white, which was a zinc and titanium. It could be, it looks like maybe, especially in this close-up, I can kind of see what's going on a little better. It does look like in this area, for example, if you had picked up a little medium on your brush and tried to add more paint here, and it started lifting off, that is due to the medium, there being too much medium in the paint. You're almost, with a scumble, you're almost doing more of a dry brush, okay? Medium can be used as you're thinning over let's say the more halftone areas. But where you want to go thicker, try using a little less medium, and that should help. Oh, so you didn't add medium to the white? The medium on the ground was running. Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, and this also could happen if, like, the lifting here or the uneven kind of patchiness can happen if your paint is more transparent. A lot of this can be evened out in a second layer of scumble. And I would suggest like spreading the scumble over areas like here, because even though it looks like a darker halftone on her face, it's still part of the light mass. The only area where you should have some of that more redder tone is like in this secondary halftone section right in here. That would be more like what you have in here. But in this area, I feel like it should be maybe more like what you have in some of these areas. A lot of that unevenness, though, will end up being covered up. So I don't think you need to worry too much about that as far as making corrections to it and fussing over it. You have the basic layout of your light mass. I can feel that sense of form kind of going across here. So I think when you go in with the mixed values, you're going to be using thicker application of paint. You might add a little bit more titanium to your mixture because it has a more intense covering power for direct painting. You can also, because it has titanium in it, it might be okay. So I'm not sure. It's kind of hard to tell because it's not what I'm working with, why it's giving you trouble, but you can try. Have you painted with this mixture, like doing maybe more of like an alla prima or direct painting technique? Because it should, oh, okay. So, you know, what we're doing in the next week is more direct alla prima. So you shouldn't have too much of an issue. I mean, it's not alla prima, but it is more of a direct approach for blocking in the light mass. So it should feel maybe a little more familiar. Again, this stage is just for establishing, you know, a general sense of the values. And then you're using Robert Simmons. Those are pretty good brushes, but when you get a chance in the future, I highly recommend ordering some rosemary brushes. Like I said, the ivories, and then I use mongoose. They're really like my favorite brushes for using this technique. It's okay that you couldn't get them in time. I used to use Robert Simmons, the synthetics, but it's sometimes they're a little soft for laying down enough paint, and I've had that issue where it actually lifts away. You would think that a softer brush would lay down more paint, but that's not always the case. With the rosemary, she has developed a type that it's true that she's kind of run out of the mongoose brushes that are genuine mongoose, but she has developed a blend of natural hairs. I believe they're badger, which tends to be a little bit more like bristly and firm, but she treats the hair in a way that helps it feel a little bit more like mongoose. And honestly, I have some of those and I can't tell the difference between the mongoose and the other one. So I still recommend getting some to try. I also really like her evergreen line. I've tried those. I have a couple of those in like the long filberts. The evergreen that's kind of like a synthetic green soft sable. They're really, really nice to work with as well. They're great for direct painting. A little too soft for something like the scumble, but they would work good for laying out or blending out your second layer. And I think I might show that one in the video. I can't recall, but that's also a really good one. Okay. I don't think, you also had a question, is your imprimatura too dark? I really don't think so. Here, I can't tell which photo is your painting closest to in life. The one on the right or this one here on the left. Because this one on the right maybe is a little dark, but on the left it looks fine. So it's a little hard for me to tell which one. But based on what I'm seeing here as the overall picture, it looks fine to me. Okay, yeah, so I would just leave it. Mine's pretty dark to begin with, and so whenever I plan my imprimatura, I try to aim for what the reflected light value will be in the face. So I look for something like that value, because then after that you glaze these other areas darker, and then you scumble to get your halftones, and then later you mix to get your halftones. So you're kind of aiming for that shadow value to be kind of warm and transparent, and it looks like you have it just fine. Okay. Yeah, I think you're fine. It feels a little bit dark if you've never worked this way. A lot of people are used to working against like a lightly toned panel, or they'll work against, no tone, they'll work against white. And so this technique can kind of throw you off if you're not used to starting from the dark and building towards the lights. But that's how a lot of the Dutch and Flemish painters worked. They would start with a darker ground and build up lights. And by having some of those halftones kind of scumbled, you get those kind of cool transitions in the flesh tones. So it's kind of priming for that process down the line when you start introducing full color. That's okay. It doesn't matter. Yours looks really close because I feel like this is a luminous reflected light, and you can still go darker here and here. So I think you're just fine. I wouldn't worry about that. Oh wow! So you're starting really dark, like a black gesso. That can have a really cool effect as well. So let me just look really quick at the. So you had a huge difference with your drawing. I remember you had posted that. So all I wanted to do was just kind of look between these two. I didn't see all that much to change. When I'm looking, the main thing is I see a little bit of a difference in the left side of the mouth here. And it has more to do with how this lip kind of downturns. And then the kind of triangular relationship for the eye. The highest peak in her upper lid is directly above the direction she's looking. So, and that's usually the case with the eyes. So let me flash between those again. Yeah, I think you could just open up the eye a little bit more on that left side. She has very large eyes. It's not by very much though. You can see it's more that you just need to bring the dark up a little higher for the lash line. And this is like the underside of the water line, and this is her lash line here. So if you just brought that dark up a little higher, it'll lock in the eye shape. The far left eye, let's take a look at that. It has something to do with maybe the tilt. I would look at where, this relationship is. I'm just going to place a few spots there. Yeah, you're really close. So actually where you have it open on the left side is good. You're just going to want to raise that up a little bit. And where you have the bottom is right on the mark. So the only area you need to bring up is this section here. So it's from here to here. And that's going to give you this feeling of this tilt. And you can see here with the mouth, you just have your line coming straight out. If you just scumble a little bit over this, it'll turn the mouth down just a little bit. Where you have the mouth placed is just fine as well. So it's a matter of just changing where you put this little dark shape and bringing it in a little closer, and you're on the money with everything else. So I think you can move forward into the next stage. Do you have any other questions? You're very, very welcome. Yeah, this looks great. It was a huge difference from the previous week with the proportions of the face. Yeah, you just did a fabulous job. So I look forward to seeing it develop more. All right, sounds good. I'll see you next week. All right, thank you, Janine, for being flexible. All right, let's talk a little bit about your portrait. You have a really nice start here. And I don't think I saw all that many changes. I didn't make any adjustments ahead of time. So I just wanted to kind of flash between these two. The main thing I see is there's a little bit of an adjustment in the mouth. It's almost like you have her lips puckered just a little bit more. It's very, very subtle. Maybe a little bit, yeah, the eyes look pretty good. Yeah, so let's just address the mouth a little bit. I think that's the main thing in the expression that I'm seeing. So the points I kind of look for are this center line and these outer corners. If the lips are looking a little puckered, it usually means that this is too short, or the shape is maybe a little more pursed. So let's take a look at that real quick. Okay, so what I'm seeing is that this needs to come down a little bit, and the corner of the mouth should be a little bit longer. It's okay that your height is up here, but I think definitely a little bit longer. If you just continued that slope down, you would end up in a pretty close or similar spot. I think your position for the center of the mouth is fine, but I would look at where the little Cupid's bow shape here is sitting, because yours is sitting a little bit to the left, which is also making it seem like she's puckering her lips just a little bit. And with this eye here, I would just make sure you kind of open that up. Let me draw it in with dark. So I would just look at bringing that up a little higher so that we feel that compression here in this section. It's minor, but it's mostly just bringing that up and unifying that dark with the shape above it. Everything else is really nice, so I think you can move into the second layer once you get some of those adjustments to the lips, and you'll have her, you already have her likeness everywhere else. Make sure though when you're toning that you don't neglect some of these smaller shadow shapes. So like you can kind of see here, there's a cast shadow, kind of the zigzag from her eyelashes, and it looks like you're bringing your light up a little farther. So just make sure you have that darker shape kind of in here, and maybe double check this angle, but I think it's mostly that that shadow shape not being there that was throwing it off. So yeah, that's pretty much it. It looks really great. Do you have any questions? Okay, yeah. And liquid, it does have kind of like a solvent in it, so it will kind of lift if that layer is not dry. So make sure before you make some of these corrections that your paint layer is not tacky at all. It should be like dry to the touch. If it's at all sticky, just let it dry a little bit longer, just to make sure. Yeah, that was probably a good idea so you don't lose your drawing. So yeah, just let it dry really well before you go in and make some of those corrections. And you can make a lot of these corrections with just washes of brown, for example, bringing that little shadow shape down. And same thing with the lips. And then you can let those corrections dry and then move into the second stage of the painting. Or you can do it like I show in the demo, which is make the drawing adjustments kind of as I'm painting more with the opaque mixtures. I move the mouth in my painting, so you'll see exactly how I did that and how you can proceed with your painting. But yeah, really nice job. It looks great. All right. Marina, are you in here? All right. So yeah, really nice drawing with your underpainting. It's looking very solid. Definitely have more of a likeness, and her eyes are nice and large. I didn't see too many corrections. There's a slight difference, I would say, with the nose. Her nose is a little bit wider to the right in this section here. So let me just go in and mark out a few areas. So you'll see here, just looking at position of that width of the ball of the nose and where her shadow shape sits. It's just a little bit wider. I think I see your corner of the nostril here. So I would just open up that light shape a little bit wider and make sure that that corner of the wing of the nostril at least reaches here, because it correlates to the eyes. And then when you get into the mouth here, make sure this isn't so straight. You'll see that there's a pretty subtle dip here, and then a little slight upturn there. But that's going to give a little more of a dynamic range to the lips. Okay, and yeah, let me just take one last look at the eyes. Yeah, that looks pretty good. This little section here is really dark, so I know it's hard to see where those inner corners of her eyes are. But just make sure you put a little bit maybe of a cast shadow underneath that eyelash line here, because it's making her eyes seem very open. So just put in a little dark shape underneath that, like a little cast shadow from the eyelashes. And you should be ready for the next stage of the painting. And I really like the soft handling you did here It's easy to want to overemphasize all the anatomy going on in the lower neck. And it's not that we want to leave it too generic, but I always say it's better if it looks just a slight amount softer, so that way it doesn't pull the eye down into that area. I think you could go maybe a little brighter down in here, in the chest and in the sternum. There should be maybe a little more light through this middle section. But you can just do that in the next layer. So really nice job. All right, so I know we kind of ran over into our group B, so I'm just going to jump over to that. We only have a few more. So Susan, are you, wait, did I grab the wrong group? Nope, I did not. Okay, making sure. Okay, Susan, are you ready to go? I thought I saw you in here. Yep, I did. There you are. Okay. Yeah, really nice job. Let me pull up some of your questions. So you were having issues with the paint flaking and drying, and we had talked a little bit already about linseed versus liquin. So you can try using the linseed oil instead. It should help a little bit, but again, make sure you're not letting it be too runny. And whenever I add linseed, to my mixtures, I always mix it in with a palette knife to the whole pile of paint. That way I don't get, I dip my brush in and suddenly I have a very runny area, so it helps with the consistency. So that might be a good tip, is just to add a few drops of linseed oil to your mixture to give it a little bit more fluidity, but make sure it's not runny. And every time you dip in with your brush, it'll be consistently the same texture. Let's see, your other questions, how to get the white smooth. I think you did a pretty good job getting the white smooth, even though it was giving you some trouble. I do feel like maybe it went a little too white in some areas, like down in here. You can see if we isolated that layer in the jaw, it's a little bit more of a mid-tone. But that's not going to be that much trouble for you to go in with a little more mid-tone. Yeah, you can start with 1 drop. I think I add a little bit of oil in the new videos to some of my darker values because my burnt umber is starting to dry up in the tube and it's just super pasty. So I add like 2 or 3 drops. I just have like a little a bottle that lets me put out 1 drop at a time. You couldn't get what to work properly? The white paint. If it builds up a little bit here too, it's probably just from layering more white. But when you go in and you're starting to lay in your tiles, make sure you put in a nice mid-tone value for this section here, and make sure you have like that fall off of light down in the jaw, and it'll build up more of that 3-dimensional quality. Oh, the white, yeah. It didn't feel that way when you were using the brown though, right? So it shouldn't be the panel that's causing it. It's probably just the paint. So with regards to drawing details, the only thing that really stood out to me was the width of the mouth. If you kind of look back and forth, the width of the mouth and maybe a little bit of the width across the eyes. But most importantly, make sure that you shorten up that mouth there. It could be a little bit of the tilt being off as well. I do feel like her eye sits a little closer to the bridge of the nose, and it looks like you might have a little too much spacing in here. So let me bring up the photo reference real quick, and I'm going to mark in a different color where her eye sits. And I'll talk a little bit about the tilts here as well. Okay, so you can see where the red dots are. That's where the eye should be positioned, and that could be why the mouth ended up so wide, because I assume you were using the iris to line it up. Notice where the tear duct sits in relationship to the nose, and then once you move that eye over, you'll see that the mouth relates to that as well. It was just feeling a little wide across this section too. One of the things when I'm drawing portraits, I always look for too is this kind of triangulation. These two triangle relationships, those help me to position the features. And of course, I always look for how the eyes relate to the nose and the mouth. I think the shape you have on that eye is good. It's just, if you can, nudge it over. I would start by sketching it in, maybe with a pencil on top of your painting, the new position for the eye, and then I would cover up this area. I can do a quick paint over for you. Let me just add a new layer. So the first thing I would do is sketch in the new position, and then I would take my white, and you can do this in the mixed value range too. But I would just scumble over to make the old lines fade a little bit. And then I would take my dark and reposition the eye where I see it based on where I placed my pencil lines. So let me take away some of those shapes there. So just make sure you're looking at, so when you are moving it, draw it with the pencil, but then make sure you're looking at that relationship between the nose and the mouth. And if I went in and covered up the mouth to where it should be, yeah, that's about right. Okay, so you can see the difference there. Now I haven't put in the upper lid, so it looks a little funny, but it's a little more in line with the other eye too. Now with the other, I think I made some marks for the other eye too. Once you get this left eye placed, look at the diagonals for where this eye should kind of open up. I feel like this left eye got maybe a little squished and narrow, but I would say focus on getting this right eye placed first and then make your adjustments for the left eye. So yeah, it's a small change relatively compared to all the other, because everything else is placed really well. So I think as soon as you get that eye moved over, you'll feel other things lock in. Oftentimes we don't see those things until they get moved, and then they stand out to us. You won't ever be able to unsee it. It's like one of those things. It's like as soon as I noticed that the mouth was a little off in my drawing, I couldn't just move forward. I had to fix it because it was going to bother me. Should your second layer be less white on her face? You'll see, have you watched, I assume you haven't watched the new videos yet, right? Because what we do is actually mix halftones. We mix the brown and the white together. The only area you're not going to place any white is in that shadow mask, but all through here we will actually be mixing the values that you see. So when you get to that point, it should be more, you know, in that value range that you're seeing here in the portrait, in the photo. So you can see if I just darken that a little bit, even though it's kind of a grayish color, it gives her more angularity to her face. And I know it's not all that color. She has like a little bit of highlight there on her jawline, but it gives her a more sculpted lower half of the face. Oops. So there you can see the slight difference there. But you don't have to do that with scumbles, just do that with the mixed values when you're ready to move into the second stage, okay? But yeah, really nice job though. I think you have a great likeness, and I look forward to seeing it move on. One of the things you might want to watch for when you are doing your mixed values is this left cheek. It is overall too light. You will notice that even the lightest value in here, let's say right in there, is about that. So it's almost like the mid-tone for the right side of the face. And that's going to reinforce that fall off of light going across the form this way. So just pay attention to that. Your lightest areas should really be in this upper half of the face, and then everything, all the light kind of falls off coming down this way and across this way because her head's on that tilt. Yeah, I think you could actually bring, I didn't say anything about that because I assumed you were probably going to bring a little bit of those little wisps out. Yeah, you can start to break that up. Her hair kind of pushes out a little more right through, right through this little section. And same thing around the face. You can start to break up like a few little wisps of hair and start to make that feel a little bit less like a solid mass. And we start to put in highlights in the hair too in the new videos, so you'll be able to start to model some of the forms in the hair a little bit better too. All right, so if you have any follow-up questions, just send me an email. Really nice job. All right, Dee, are you in here? Did you have some questions? No. Okay. So I think overall you do have a general likeness of the model, so that's really nice. The main thing that is throwing me, I think, is the mouth and maybe a little bit in the eyes and their relationship to the mouth. The nose is also a little bit dark, but oops, let me bring back my other photo. There we go. So here I have a few small corrections, mostly with the width here in the face. You can see I'm going to have you push over. Now, right here in the cheek, you're right on the mark, and you can see here in the brow, you're on the mark. So just give her a little more fullness throughout this little section here. And then the mouth mostly needs to move to the left. And I think part of that was because you actually have the correct spacing here, but you have the mouth position back a little bit too far. So by pushing that out, you'll be able to see where to place the lips. Also make sure that the upper lip is a little bit more square in its shape where the opening of the lip is here. Overall, you had the shape pretty good, but it needed to be a little more simple. She has that very kind of square top lip, or sorry, bottom lip. I think the eye on the right just got a little big. She already has very large eyes, but I think where you have the line here is okay. But I think it's this inner corner that you pushed over a little far. Could be pushed back to more like right around here. But keep this part where it is. And that'll shorten that distance and give you a little more foreshortening on the eye. And then on the left eye, I think it feels small in comparison to the right eye. So just make sure you open that eye up a little bit taller. So the lash line should come up to about there. Then you'll have your crease above that. Okay, you might need to reassess this brow as well. Let me look between. Yeah, so you'll need to raise that eyebrow a little bit higher to give a little more room in there. But once you get some of those features moved, I would start with maybe the eye and then go in and adjust the mouth. You should have more of an accurate likeness. Her ear was also a little bit small. Here, you can see it kind of got shrunk. It actually comes back wider to about here. And even though her hair kind of comes in front, just make sure we have a feeling that that ear continues back and that it comes down lower. Look at the ear in relationship to the mouth and the eye. Okay, so just looking at those relationships can help. All right, so really nice job, and I look forward to seeing the rest of it. If you have any questions following up, just send me an email, of course. Okay, Sahar, I know you had sent me an email. You were feeling a bit discouraged because you had lost some of the transfer. So I'm going to just help you get some of the features back on track. So I did a quick little paint over just to show you where I think the biggest adjustment needs to be, and I see it down here in the mouth. The eyes are actually anchored pretty good in the drawing. So what we need to do is focus on bringing that nose and the mouth over just a little bit. So here's the lines to where the new position should be. So the nose is very minor. It's really just a matter of bringing this halftone over like that up until this edge. And also her nose doesn't have as strong of a bend. It's a little bit more straight. So just make sure when you're adjusting that shape to bring it over a little bit. And then with the mouth, I think you had your nostril out here, narrow that, and then use that to help you find the triangulation in the lips. I think you'd widen the mouth a little bit because you had the nose out to here. So if you think about it, we're kind of moving them in about that much. That should help you lock your portrait into place again, and I don't think you need to start over because everything else is pretty close. Just make sure in the next layer that you get these positioned, and also lower this eyebrow just a tiny bit so that we maintain, whoops, we maintain that tilt between all of the features. Okay, so your tilt between the eyes seems pretty good. It's a little hard for me to see in this photo where this eye is positioned, but just when you're kind of locking it in, just make sure that you have the matching tilt between the top lid and the bottom lid. And if you have any follow-up questions, just send me an email. All right, David. I don't think you said you were able to attend live, but if you're in here, say hi in the chat box. Okay, so we talked a little bit also, I think you said you had, let me get, there we go. Okay, so I did a little paint over, and I just wanted to show this to everyone. So David had sent me a picture of his transfer, and you can kind of see down here at the bottom, down in here, that his lines did transfer, but then there was all these watermarks, and a lot of the lines kind of got blotted. And so the reason this can happen is if you use too much Gamsol and your paint was too wet in the transfer. Oh, there you are. Hi. So if your paint hasn't sunk into the paper enough, this can happen. And I don't know if you remember, but when I was starting the transfer, I did a little test, and I noticed that mine was doing the same thing. So I blotted it down with a paper towel, wiped it down. You don't want to rub it all off, but it will pick up some of the excess, and you won't have as much of an issue. And I also had mentioned that you could use oil pastel to do the same kind of transfer. So if I was doing a transfer in oil pastel, I would take my pastel and color over on the back of the paper over where my lines are. It's just a little more time consuming than the oil technique. But this can be an issue with the oil technique, so just something to be aware of. I always do a little tiny test before I actually go through with my transfer so that I don't run into these kind of issues. Also, waiting a few minutes for your tone on the back of the transfer paper to kind of set in. It should look kind of, the sheen on it should look kind of matte. You can always just be safe and lightly blot the surface with a paper towel. And it's not that big of a deal if you get a couple of specks like you see in here and here, because those can be wiped up with a paper towel pretty easily. But it does make it hard when that's happening in the eyes or important areas, because it muddles your drawing and you risk wiping it away. And we talked about moving the placement of the eye for your drawing. So I'm going to just lay the transfer over. And so what I'm seeing mostly is it's with the right eye, which looks like is the one you had trouble with the transfer. No, it's not due to using the vellum. I mean, tracing paper would do the same thing, but I use vellum in mine, so the vellum shouldn't be the problem. It's just if you use too much Gamsol to thin it, the paint. You can also just try buffing the paint over the surface on the back with a rag. That can help too if you don't want to try with the Gamsol, but maybe you didn't let the Gamsol evaporate off long enough. And in that case, it was still very wet when you started to do the transfer. So yeah, so what I'm seeing is mostly that eye. The left eye seems pretty close. It needs to maybe be, let me, yeah, it needs to be a little bit lower and just a little more descript. What you could do is try sketching over your drawing, over your painting with a pencil to reposition the eye, just so you have a more clear sense of where it sits. And then this eye here is going to move down kind of diagonally. And you'll notice that the eyebrow also moves down diagonally. I did a little paint over to where the correct position should be. So you can kind of see that here. So the mouth, the main thing is that that left side of the mouth needs to come up. Your right corner of the mouth actually didn't change. So leave the right corner here in the right spot. So you can kind of see that. So you'll want to leave that in the right spot, but make sure you're lifting that corner of the mouth up. So that way, the most important thing is that we have these tilts, you know, matching. And then when you're going in to describe that left eye, I would focus on getting the right eye positioned first, and then use that tilt to help you establish the position of the left eye. And you can do, like I've mentioned to others, you can do the drawing just to get the position correct in pencil. Just, you know, mark out where it is and then go in with your paint and start to adjust. One thing that you'll notice too is that I moved this shadow shape in, and I described the left shadow edge for the nose a little more clearly in this paint over, and I'll send you a picture of the paint over as well, so it can, you know, you can use that to help you see that a little better. All it's doing is kind of simplifying and closing up this space a little bit, and the side plane of the head kind of starts above the ear and goes down the edge of the cheekbone to the corners of the chin. And that's why we have that shadow shape come in a little bit more. Does that make sense? So what I'll do is I'll send you this layover, and I'll send you the paint over, so that you can kind of compare the two and just see as you're correcting. I hope that was helpful. Let me look back at your questions, because most of your questions were about the transfer. You said shadow and highlight paint on... Oh, okay, so you were wondering if when you tone in your shadows and then you go in and put in your lights, do you let it dry between? That's completely optional. I don't usually, because I'm very careful about not bringing my white over to the edge of my shadow completely. But if you're worried about it getting muddy, then I suggest, yes, you leave the shadows to dry for a day and then go back in with your white the very next day. And then how do you deal with stopping painting halfway through? And I think you said you kind of had to stop somewhere in this area, like in the cheek or something. And then how do you pick up and make it look seamless? The trick is really to kind of feather out wherever you're stopping. Just, it's better to stop kind of thin and spread it out so that the edge is almost not detectable. That's in like an ideal situation. I would have just spread my paint out and kind of let it run out on the brush, or I would have wiped some of this away so it wasn't so heavy. And that way when I go back in, I'm careful not to overlap where I had thinned it out, and I start my scumble going the opposite direction. And then you won't end up with a real like heavy spot. But you know, it's not like every day we can all just sit there and, you know, get the painting done all the way through. So, you know, if you're gonna kind of move methodically, I always work like segment by segment instead of jumping around. I kind of talk about this, I think, in the new videos too. Like working, let's say, work in the forehead to the bridge of the nose. So maybe that would be, you know, this would be 1 day's work here, and I'd maybe stop somewhere mid-tone. I wouldn't go quite into the eye because that's separated by the eyebrow, so that would be kind of an easy place to leave off. And then maybe if I'm doing the nose, I want this side to be pretty seamless, you know, going across this way. So I'd make sure I get that section done in one sitting. The eye, oops. So if you think about the planes of the head and how things are broken up, you can kind of go based on that. And it'll make it a little easier to go a little more seamless in your process. So life happens, we get interrupted, and we can't get back to our painting. It's not that big of a deal. Just main thing is feathering out your edges so that when you paint back in, you don't have a ridge there in the paint. So yeah, I think I addressed all your questions. Do you have any other ones? I hope everyone else is finding this information helpful too. because I'm sure there's more than one person who's had similar issues. Or you might run into this issue when you try the process again. And with a little practice, you'll get a feel for how wet the transfer should be. You'll also get a feel, those of you who've had trouble with your white, you might try doing a little practice scumble, just like almost like you do a value scale. Create an imprimatura and then practice scumbling out your white, because it could be partly technique, but it's good to experiment and see what works for you. Try different brushes, try different whites. It is a very efficient underpainting process, and I know when I go into full color, oftentimes I will leave my painting at this stage in the scumble and then go directly into color on top. So getting this technique down can be really useful for the long, kind of the long haul as far as transitioning into color. You can also, like what the approach we're going to be doing is bringing the painting more to a resolve in the tonal stage and then using glazes to, indicate color down the line if that's something you're interested in doing. But even just getting a handle on technique, as you guys can probably see, and getting used to the materials, it can easily get overwhelming for someone trying to learn to oil paint, especially on their own, because you don't know what you're doing wrong, and it's hard to kind of isolate that. So that's where doing the tonal portraits first is really, really helpful. It gives you an opportunity to study technique and process and get a handle on your comfort with the medium. Lori, yes, I will be in the future, but the thing with color painting is there's so much to go into. It's probably going to be quite a long course. I still haven't quite figured out the logistics of how long it's going to end up being, because I do an underpainting process, but I'm going to have to talk about color mixing, also skin tones, and there's just a lot involved. So I plan to probably release something hopefully in February after the new year, because things are kind of hectic during the holidays for everyone, so there just wouldn't be enough time to offer something before then. But yeah, you guys will probably get a notice at some point in the future when I have an announcement for when that will be. Yeah, practice. It's all about practice. And when I was self-taught, I practiced a lot, but I worked in color and I didn't really know what I was doing, and I was guessing at how to mix a shadow color, and one of the things that helped me was learning to do a tonal painting and getting my technique down for tonal painting. It's like learning to draw before you can jump into oil painting. This is a great way to help you transition into full color portrait painting. But there's so much more that you're juggling in color. You're talking about chroma, you're talking about hue, you're talking about skin tones, which are layered and complex. We're talking about warm and cool. So it can get really overwhelming for someone who's never painted portraits before. So I always find that starting with the tonal is a great way to kind of build towards that. And it also is part of the process that I use. Every single painting I do has an underpainting like this. I spend that time because my paintings take me months to do, but I invest that time in the underdrawing so that I don't have to backtrack so much when I'm working in color. So it's kind of like doing, your due diligence early on in your painting, and it saves you a lot of headache later on in your painting. So yeah, and I'll talk a little bit about, how you can play. This technique works for any subject you want to paint too. I mean, I use this for still life as well. And with still life, you can just go in and glaze color into something that's a tonal painting or like a grisaille, and you will have something that looks relatively finished. So yeah, it's a great way to kind of get yourself into color mixing. Yeah, yeah. It's, it's a lot of people think it's a little boring to do the tonal grisaille first. They don't want to spend the time to do this, but really for portrait, I almost feel like it's 100% necessary because skin tones are very complex, and there's no formula for painting a person's skin tone, um, because every single person has a different skin tone, and there's so many factors to think about. Um, has anyone seen? I think it was Pantone or Kodak or something. There was like a big project where they had photographed thousands of people under neutral kind of lighting, and they were trying to identify like their inherent like local color, what we call local color, their inherent kind of skin tone, and not a single person had the same undertones. And so that, I mean, that's mind blowing if you think about it. And we're already kind of limited. We have only pigments, certain number of pigments to work with, and so as artists, there's a lot of factors to consider. Um, so you can't just grab a tube of flesh tone from the art store that says flesh tone and expect it to work for your portraits. It doesn't always work that way. It might work for one person's portrait, but it won't work for anyone else's. So, yeah, wasn't that amazing, Lori? It really blew my mind because it really gets you thinking about color when I do portraits, and it's so easy to fall back on like almost like habits or formulas, because formulas make things easy, but there is no formula. There are kind of guidelines, but there is no like, if I mix just these, I'll get the perfect skin tone for any person. That's just not true. So anyhow, long story short, yes, I'll be offering something, but it'll be in a couple of months. All right, Sean, I know you had, I just wanted to talk, I know you don't have anything for me to talk about, but Sean had a very unfortunate experience. His transfer blew into like he had some issue with the transfer, and he was setting it out to dry and it blew into the rain. Poor guy. And so anyhow, he doesn't have anything for me to address, but Sean, if you are watching this and you have questions, once you get caught up, just reach out to me and let me know. Okay, so, oops, sorry, hit the other. All right, Dennis. Are you live, Dennis? Are you with us in the chat room? Okay, well, I'm going to just talk a little bit about your drawing. So this was his transfer. He had a little bit of the paint kind of bleed through, I think, with his transfer. But we were talking about some of the drawing issues. So let's see. It was pretty minor. I feel like mostly it had to do with the width established for the ear. I felt like the eyes, it's not that they're not in the right position. It's more about getting that foreshortening to the shape. So if you look at her eyes, in here, you can kind of see that she has this, and I realize this particular photo is a little hard to see on this inner corner, but her lash line is kind of like that, right? And we're seeing a little bit of that underside. And so you'll notice that there's this height here, and then the lowest point is kind of on a diagonal here. So looking at that particular shape, you'll see that the eye can kind of open up a little bit more, but also that yours is a little just more flat and kind of neutral. This one does have that kind of opening feeling, but I think maybe it got a little too tall. So I would maybe bring that part down and give a little more eyelid showing on that far eye. With regards to the nose, your shadow shape seemed pretty good on the nose, but it did need a little more variety. So you'll notice that it has kind of, instead of being just this straight shape, here let me remove the overlay real quick. So you can see you have a pretty straight edge down the nose, and if you look, there's a little bit more of a dance with these shapes, and it just gives it a little bit more interest. So look for some of that variety in that shape. And also look at where this cast shadow comes down. I think it doesn't dip below the mouth. There's maybe a little reflected light down in there, but your shadow shape should kind of come up a little higher. And then the main one, besides the eyes, is that the mouth was sitting a little low. The right corner was in the right spot, but this here and this corner here seemed a little off. It could be that the cast shadow just got too low. So if you just take a little bit of light color and you bring this up by about that much, and then you bring your line for the lip just a little bit higher, it should help it lock in. So you can kind of see that shape difference. Okay, but that was it. I think everything else looks good, and you can move into the next stage. I'm assuming just here in the neck that this is where you have the neck shape. Let me draw that with white right in here. That seems a little more accurate because this out here felt a little wide. But because there's this difference here, I'm wondering which one it is. But I would bring this in so that her neck feels a little bit more narrow, and maybe bring that in just a little bit. Okay, so if you have any follow-up questions, just send me an email. And also make sure you get some light mask down in here. You can wait until the next layer, but a light scumble, nothing too detailed, just a little bit to balance out the portrait. All right, last person. Carolina, are you in here? Ah, there you are. Hi, how are you? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some of the changes I've seen. The main thing I'm feeling is actually down in her jawline, down in here, and maybe a little bit on the positioning of the mouth. It feels a little bit high, and this feels maybe a little rounded and low. So let's take a look at where that is positioned. So you can kind of see where your line comes down for the jaw and where hers is sitting. Now her crease for her underside of her chin is like somewhere in there, but the shadow comes up a little bit higher. So let me take and do my overlay here. Okay, so yeah, if you bring the shadow shape up for the chin down here, up to this edge here, and then kind of angle it back, and this should be the bottom of that shadow shape, you'll start to get a little bit more of the correct length for her lower jaw. And then I do feel like the mouth just needs a little more definition where the opening is. So you could go in just with a little bit of a darker tone and then make sure you're dropping that corner of the mouth a little bit lower, somewhere around there. It should correlate to the ear as well. With the eye, I think this eye needs to come up, and look at where, what you can do is drop some vertical lines and see where, like straight up and down, where the iris here sits in relationship to the nose and the mouth. Once you get the mouth, actually I think your width on the right side is actually correct. It was just the height on the mouth. So you can use where the mouth is now to help you position where the iris should be. And that's going to get her looking in the correct direction. And then where, let's see, it's almost where you have your upper crease for the eyelid should be the opening of the eyelashes. So you're going to just be moving that eye up a little bit, but leaving the brow where it is. Her eyebrow does extend over to the left and overlap into the keystone shape just a little bit more. And then I would make sure you bring that shadow shape over on her forehead a little bit. Her ear also felt a little low. You have it placed about here. Just remember to coordinate. You could even go straight across if it helps. Look at how it relates to the nose and where this one sits in relationship. If the diagonals are too hard to see, just bring horizontal lines across and just see what it relates to in the photo, and it'll help you get the correct placement. It can be kind of tricky because the head is on that tilt. These shouldn't be too hard to change at this stage because you haven't. Have you added any white to the light areas? It doesn't look like it. Hi Gus, I don't know if you're still here. I just saw your comment. Welcome. Okay, you did add white, so I would build up a little bit more to the light mask here. You do want to have it, you know, at least loosely kind of blocked in. Oops. You know, where those light tones are, just so that you have a pattern to kind of go by. You know, when you start going into the mixed values. It'll make your job a little bit easier for the next layer. So maybe do one more scumble over that. Yeah, it could be a little bit brighter. But that's okay. What I would do before you add the white is make the drawing corrections for the eyes and the mouth. And as far as like correcting it, oops, keep doing that. Okay, so as far as correcting like where the ear, for example, comes out too wide, you can mix a color that looks similar to this and just cover it up. You can also paint in the background because it looks like it might need to go a little darker with a mixed value in the next layer, so don't worry about that either. It can be fixed very easily. Do you have any questions? Oh, and I forgot to mention, the shoulder here could come up. I know you were asking about the width, fitting the width of the shoulders in. I do feel that foreshortening, but I think what would help is to move this ruffle a little more diagonal and a little bit wider maybe. So move it over that way, because that way it feels like the center line to the body and we get that sense of the foreshortening. And then raise this shoulder on the right side, so that way we get a little bit of a tilt between the shoulders. Yeah, just let me know if you have any other questions. I think you're pretty good. You could start to break up some of the edges in the hair, but you can do that in the next layer after you've watched the new videos. All right, everyone, that is it for today's critique. Now, next weekend, I am going to be gone at that conference, but we will still be holding critique. So hopefully the Wi-Fi at the hotel will be good enough for us to stream. If it's too choppy, then we'll probably redo a critique maybe later in the week, but it should be okay. I don't foresee any major issues. I know there's a lot of work to do this week. As far as videos, I think we broke it down into 4 videos because they're pretty long. And I go a little bit in depth on how to tile out and lay in some of the paint. So if everyone's feeling for critiques, if your group, if everyone's kind of feeling like they need more time, just get your painting as far as you can for the next critique, and we can always extend critiques an additional week if everyone needs a little bit more time to get stuff finished. I know a week is kind of a tight timeline to watch hours of video and then make these corrections and develop your painting. So just get as far as you can, even if it's just focused on a section of the face. Get the drawing corrections done and then start working on that second layer. Does anyone have any questions that I can answer at the end? I'm pretty sure we covered it all, but if you're just now popping in and you have any questions, just type it in the chat box. Thank you, Lori. I'm really glad you're enjoying the class. Thanks, Susan. You too. Have a good week. All right, everyone. I think that's it then for today. I'll stay in touch with you guys throughout the week as you develop your paintings on Facebook, and of course you guys can email me. I might not get back to you until the evening because I'll be at the convention during the day all next week. I think from the 6th through the 11th. But I'll try to get back to everyone as soon as possible just so that you guys aren't waiting on me to answer your questions before you proceed. Oh, Susan, yes, I will be providing the color photos. In fact, I'll try to, let me think. I'm not sure if I have those with me here at home, but if I do, I'll upload them to the site. If not, I will provide them next week when you get the final lesson. That way you guys do have the color versions to work from. Gus, to answer your question, when we see old master work, if we don't see brushstrokes, is it okay to assume it's grisaille? Typically, yes, I would say so, but it depends on what kind of era you're talking about, because William Bouguereau is very, very smooth, almost glass smooth in his paintings, but he didn't do grisaille. He did a little bit of a different technique, kind of like where you do a dead coloring layer. It's I don't know the pronunciation. I'm probably going to butcher it, but I think it's called a bauche. You can read a little bit. I think the Underpaintings blog, those of you who are familiar with it, I think they did a little article on that technique. I will type it, the spelling, here in the chat room. There's an accent in there. I think it's a French term. But that's kind of the technique that he used, but he painted very smooth. Well, there's several techniques. Grisaille was early, closer to like early Renaissance, or there's something called Verdaccio. We're learning something more related to like Flemish or Venetian technique. It depended on the region, but a lot of them are very similar, and the differences between them are kind of nuanced and subtle. One of the things that makes us maybe our technique a little more similar to the Dutch technique is that we are leaving transparency in our shadows. So that's similar if you look at like Rembrandt and you look at especially like Van Dyck and Rubens would be a good example. You'll notice that their shadows kind of have this translucent quality, and you're actually seeing their imprimatura as the shadow color, because you can see the long horizontal or vertical strokes from when they applied their imprimatura. Yeah, Susan, I just typed. Oh, the name of the blog. Yeah, Susan, I typed the name Abauche or Abauche above. Underpaintings blog. Now the Underpaintings blog is a subscription-based blog, but it's really worth it. He does some great articles, both on like shows and exhibits going on, and sometimes it's technical stuff. But if you look up that word, that technique, you'll find some demonstrations online about that. So is the way I'm teaching how we paint, or how I paint? Okay, yes. So I kind of, when I was studying, I did a little bit of both. I studied Verdaccio and like a more classical technique, and then I also studied like alla prima. So a lot of my work, my technique now is very much a blend, because I find that there's benefits to both of the techniques. So I use that underpainting technique that you would use very similar to like a Verdaccio or like I said, the Dutch approach for like a tonal underpainting. But I don't necessarily do, Verdaccio, sorry. It means like a underpainting in kind of green tones. That's very much like a Renaissance technique, Italian Renaissance. So I do my underpaintings, yes, and they do play a role in the upper layers of my portraits, but I do a more direct color approach over. I don't necessarily do a dead coloring layer. That would be kind of like an extra step in between. I usually go direct into color on top, and I use the tonal underpainting as my value guide, and I will often utilize it in the shadow mass for getting that warm transparency for the shadows. Alla prima is very scary. That's funny. It is really difficult. In fact, the workshop I taught yesterday was alla prima landscape, and everyone's like, this is really hard. So yeah, alla prima is challenging in its own. But I mean, I wouldn't say my approach is alla prima based. It's just I do incorporate some direct painting where you're actually mixing a specific color for an area and applying it, but I do work in multiple layers. So technically, it's, I guess, a classical method, because usually with alla prima, you're literally just sitting there and finishing the painting in one sitting. It means all at once. So it is a bit different. But the technique I'm showing in this course is definitely to help set up for preparing to move into color. Sometimes I used to bring all of my underpaintings up to the finish that we're bringing it in this class, but anymore I just don't have time to do that because I'm usually trying to meet deadlines for shows and commissions and that sort of thing. So I do a little bit more like what we did this past week, the scumbling, and I do develop it a little further, but I don't do like a full closed finished grisaille. Yeah, yeah, I don't like acrylics personally. I have a really hard time with them. They dry too quick for me. I'm a slow painter, so I like to take my time with things, and I usually block things out and then I'll go through and blend my edges after. So I need that working time with my paint. But I know some people who do some incredible figurative work in acrylic, so it blows my mind. There's a few of them that do very, very like realist work in acrylics, and I just have no idea how they do that. All right, guys. Well, I'm going to get going, and I'm going to work on getting you your edits this afternoon so you guys can get to work, since we're a little bit a day behind. And yeah, just check in with me midweek if you guys have questions. Thank you, and I'll see you next weekend. And oh, and next weekend, just a reminder, we will be meeting at our usual Saturday time. Okay? So it won't be Sunday. It'll be Saturday like usual. Thank you, Susan. All right, guys. Thank you for joining, and I'll see you next week. Have an awesome time in the studio. All right, bye-bye.